My name is Candace Miller, and the first thing I saw when I woke up this morning wasn't the familiar ceiling of my bedroom, or the soft light filtering through the linen blinds, or even the face of the man I thought I loved lying beside me. No, the first thing I saw was a flash of red, then a blinding white-hot pain, as though my entire optic nerve had been set alight. Then nothing. Just nothing. For a split second. Then a voice, clinical and distant, saying, "Subject 047 is experiencing an acute systemic rejection. Initiate immediate severance protocol." Severance protocol? Subject 047? My heart, no, my entire being, hammered against some invisible wall. My eyes snapped open, really open this time, and the ceiling was familiar, but it wasn't my bedroom. It was a sterile, unforgiving white panel, crisscrossed with faint metallic lines. I was lying flat on my back, strapped down. Or, I wasn't strapped down. My limbs were just immobile, heavy. A quick, piercing electronic hum filled the air, and a shimmering, translucent blue screen materialized directly above my face, displaying an intricate biological schematic. And it was my schematic. Or, it wasn't me. Not entirely. My throat was dry, a raw, burning landscape, but no gasp escaped. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even twitch. My mind, however, was in a sudden, catastrophic overdrive. The schematic on the screen above me was a 3D rendering, detailed to the cellular level. My body, undeniably. My organs, my circulatory system, even the faint scar tissue from that appendectomy I had at 12. But then, there it was, an anomaly, stark and horrifying. Deep within my brainstem, nestled against the very core of my identity, was a glowing, pulsating node of foreign matter. It wasn't a tumor. It was too perfectly symmetrical, too impossibly integrated. It looked engineered. And then, the voice again, closer this time, chillingly calm. Neural bypass at 98%, cerebral integration holding. The personality overlay is beginning to destabilize due to the unexpected autonomic response. Personality overlay? My personality? Was this some nightmarish dream, a drug-induced hallucination? No, the fear was too real, too visceral. It seeped into my bones, colder than any winter's night. My breath hitched, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through me. Then, the true horror began to unfold. On the perimeter of the blue screen, a smaller window flickered into existence. It was a video feed. And in it, walking across a sun-drenched terrace, was me. Or rather, a woman who looked exactly like me, dressed in my favorite blue silk dress, laughing with a man whose arm was wrapped possessively around her waist. That man. That was Marcus. My Marcus. The love of my life. My fiancé. The man I had shared my home, my bed, my deepest secrets with for the last 5 years. He was kissing her forehead, a tender, intimate gesture, the kind he reserved just for me. My stomach lurched, a sickening twist of pure, unadulterated revulsion. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was a desecration. Who was that woman? And then, a title appeared across the bottom of the video feed, a caption so utterly devoid of humanity, so utterly wrong, it made the blood freeze in my veins. Project Chimera, Phase 3, Operational Subject C Unit 047. Operational Subject C Unit 047. It was me. She was me. Or, I was her? The initial jolt of pain in my head returned, sharper this time, like 1,000 slivers of ice embedding themselves in my temporal lobe. My perception fragmented, splintered into a million pieces. I heard the murmur of other voices, indistinct at first, then coalescing into a sharp clinical debate. The primary host is showing signs of awareness. This violates Protocol 7C. Another voice, slightly deeper, resonated with authority. Irrelevant. The data acquisition from Subject C Unit 047 has exceeded all projections. Her emotional responses, her social calibrations, her love for Project Director Thorne, all flawless. Thorne. Marcus Thorne. Project Director. The words slammed into me, each one a hammer blow to my already shattered reality. Marcus. My Marcus. He wasn't just my fiancé, he was the project director. And I was a subject, a C unit, a data acquisition tool. The video feed on the screen above me zoomed in slightly, showing the other Candace leaning into Marcus, whispering something in his ear, her eyes sparkling with an eerie, perfect mimicry of my own expressions of affection. My own stolen affection. My own life, meticulously observed, meticulously recorded, and then expertly duplicated. And that thing in my brain, the engineered node, it wasn't just controlling me. It was feeding on me, or extracting from me, my memories, my emotions, my very essence, to build her, to build a better, more compliant version of me. A cold, metallic taste filled my mouth. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an annihilation of my very identity. It was a theft of my existence. 5 years. 5 years of shared dreams, of intimate moments, of building a future with a man who was, all along, dissecting my very soul, meticulously gathering every scrap of my being to construct a puppet, a better puppet. The thought was a searing brand across my consciousness. I finally managed to strain, to force a sound from my throat, a dry, ragged wheeze. Marcus? It was barely audible, a pathetic whisper. But it was enough. The voices in the room immediately ceased. A shadow fell over the blue screen above me, and a face swam into view. Not Marcus. A woman, sharp-featured, with eyes like chips of glacial ice, wearing a pristine white lab coat. Her voice was calm, utterly devoid of empathy. The primary host is fully aware. Terminate Project Chimera Phase 3. Prepare for immediate deep cryostasis of Subject 047. Deep cryostasis, essentially being frozen alive, a scientific specimen. My body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable spasm that threatened to tear me from the restraints I wasn't even sure were there. This wasn't just my life Marcus had destroyed, it was my very self, my unique self reduced to Subject 047, a data point. The searing pain in my head intensified, a crescendo of pure agony, and the last thing I heard before the world dissolved into blackness was the detached voice of the cold-eyed woman. Ensure all neural pathways are irreversibly severed. We don't want any remnants. Remnants of me. The darkness wasn't absolute. It was a suffocating, buzzing void, laced with ghost fragments of memories, like shards of shattered glass glinting in perpetual twilight. My mind, even in that terrifying stasis, clawed for purchase, for meaning. Marcus, his face, his laugh, our shared life, flickered and dissolved, then reformed, but always with a new, insidious undertow. The feeling of his hand in mine on that first date, the electric current that had zinged through me. He'd seemed so perfect, so utterly right. He was a brilliant, ambitious biotechnologist, and I, a graphic designer with a passion for intricate patterns and hidden complexities. We'd bonded over shared philosophical debates late into the night, the kind that left you feeling intellectually electrified and emotionally sated. He'd often spoken about his work in abstract terms: revolutionary neurointerfacing, biomimicry, the cutting edge of human potential. I'd seen it as his grand passion, a noble pursuit to better humanity. A few months into our relationship, he'd casually mentioned needing a baseline for a new research project, something about neural mapping and pattern recognition. He'd laughed it off, saying it was boring lab stuff, and he just needed a typical healthy brain to compare complex data against. I'd even found it endearing, his dedication. He'd asked if I'd be willing to undergo a non-invasive scan, a quick MRI, just for a statistical sample. I'd agreed without a second thought, flattered he'd even considered me. Looking back, that was the first thread he pulled, the initial snip in the fabric of my reality. He'd set up a small, sleek scanner in what he called his private research annex, a surprisingly sophisticated setup in the basement of the charming suburban house we eventually bought together. He made the process feel like a game, distracting me with silly questions about my day, gentle jokes. He even played my favorite classical music through the headphones. I never felt a thing, just the soft hum of the machine, the occasional whir. He'd produced some impressive-looking graphs afterwards, filled with colorful neural networks, and told me I had a beautifully symmetrical brain, Candace, a true artist's mind. I'd glowed with pride, completely oblivious to the insidious purpose behind his flattering words. He'd continued these routine baselines every few months, always finding a casual, believable reason. Data drift, new algorithm calibration, just a quick check-in. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was Marcus, my rock, my future. He was building us a life, a beautiful, serene existence, filled with laughter and mutual respect. Or so I thought. He was the one who encouraged me to pursue my art, pushing me to showcase my abstract pieces, even helping me set up my first gallery exhibition. He'd celebrated every small success as though it were his own, cheering me on with that disarming smile. The man who cooked me breakfast in bed every Sunday, who remembered the exact shade of blue I loved, who'd sit with me for hours as I sketched, offering insightful critiques. He was the architect of my contentment, the sculptor of my secure world. The illusion was almost perfect. There were never any red flags, no subtle cracks in his facade that I could point to now and say, ah, that was it. His affection was genuine, his presence comforting, his support unwavering. He was everything a partner should be. And that was the cruelest part of it all. He wasn't just faking it, he was living it, cultivating a relationship of profound intimacy and trust, all while systematically dismantling my core existence. He studied me, not as a lover, but as a scientist studies an experiment. Every tear, every joy, every vulnerability I'd ever shared with him, every quiet confession under the stars, every argument resolved with a tender kiss. All of it was data. Every nuance of my laughter, the way my eyes crinkled when I was truly amused, the slight tilt of my head when I was listening intently, the specific rhythm of my breathing when I slept, nothing was sacred. He wasn't building a life with me. He was building me, brick by meticulous brick, inside a laboratory. He was mirroring me, digitizing me, preparing for my obsolescence. And the deeper I fell in love, the more I willingly gave him access to the most intimate parts of my soul, because that's what love is, isn't it? An opening, a surrender of self. I surrendered to him completely, and he simply extracted me, piece by piece. He'd often speak about the future, about growing old together in that charming house, filling it with laughter and art. We'd even started picking out names for hypothetical children, debating the merits of living closer to the coast versus the mountains. All of it, a performance. Every tender touch, every whispered promise, every intimate moment we shared was a meticulously orchestrated data collection point. He wasn't connecting with me, he was observing it. The subject, the specimen, and the it was me, Candace Miller. He had dissected my soul, laid it bare under a microscope, and then used the blueprint to forge a new, engineered version. A better version, according to him. A version that would serve his undisclosed purpose. My memories, my authentic emotional responses, my deepest fears and desires. Everything was being methodically cataloged, analyzed, and synthesized. The pain of this realization was an acute physical agony, a phantom ache in the very soul that was now apparently nothing more than a biological resource. My entire life, the bedrock of my identity, was a lie. A carefully constructed cage from which I had just violently awakened. And the man who built it, the supposed love of my life, was the jailer. And now I was slated for deep cryostasis. My purpose fulfilled, the redundant original to be stored away, a relic. The thought was a searing scream in the silence of my internal darkness. The darkness wasn't just physical anymore. It had become an existential void, a chasm into which every certainty of my life plummeted. Marcus, a project director. Me, a subject 047. And that shimmering, horrifying schematic of my brain, complete with the pulsating engineered node. The personality overlay, destabilizing. It wasn't enough that he had stolen my life, my essence. He had copied it. He had replaced me. The other Candace on the screen, laughing with my Marcus, living my life, wearing my silk dress. That was the first, searing layer of the betrayal, the hot iron pressed directly onto my soul. But then, as my fragmented mind struggled to grasp this impossible reality, another layer began to peel back, rotten and festering beneath. I was conscious now, even in that terrifying mental prison. Not fully awake, but aware, like a diver trapped at the bottom of the ocean, hearing distant, muffled sounds from the surface. The voices returned, though fainter, distorted, as if filtered through a thick sheet of glass. The cold-eyed woman's voice, sharp and precise. The neural pathways are sufficiently compromised. The primary host will retain minimal long-term memory retrieval capabilities. Only traumatic, high-stress events will be accessible. Marcus's voice, not loving, but devoid of all warmth, clinical, almost bored, cut through the haze. Excellent. We can't have her recognizing herself in future iterations. The data integrity of Project Chimera is paramount. Future iterations? My head throbbed, a dull, agonizing beat. Recognizing myself? What did that even mean? And then, a new younger voice, a man I didn't recognize. Sir, the subject 047's emotional response data from the initial 5-year integration period is already being cross-referenced with the archived files. The resonance with Project Gemini's Subject 003 is uncanny. Gemini? Subject 003? The horror deepened. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't just some twisted personal vendetta from Marcus. This was a project, a program. And there were others. Other subjects. Other lives stolen, dissected, duplicated. My heart, if it could have, would have torn itself from my chest. Gemini. The name reverberated in the hollow space where myself once was. I remembered Marcus vaguely mentioning a failed project early in our relationship, a throwaway comment about a competitor's research that had gone sideways. He'd even joked about how much cleanup they'd had to do. Cleanup. The word now tasted like ash. It wasn't just my body in that schematic, not just my memory and personality being siphoned. It was my existence, rendered into an exploitable resource. My unique experiences, my grief, my joy, my love for him, all reduced to data points, to be cross-referenced and archived file. I was a template, a blueprint for something else. A chilling wave of understanding washed over me, a realization so profound, so utterly monstrous, that it threatened to shatter the last vestiges of my sanity. He wasn't just creating a new Candace. He was creating a line of Candaces. And I was the discarded prototype. The sounds became clearer, the haze lifting slightly, revealing more of the clinical conversation. Subject 047 exhibits a higher emotional processing capacity than anticipated. Her ability to synthesize complex interpersonal dynamics was exceptional. This was Marcus again. He was discussing me, his voice as dispassionate as if he were reviewing a spreadsheet. Moreover, her perceived trust in the primary operator, me specifically, allowed for an unprecedented depth of data acquisition. The love metric reached 97.4% before the stressor event. Stressor event. My entire life with him was an experiment. My devotion, my belief in him, my love was a metric. The sick irony of it was a bitter bile in my throat. He was boasting about how well he'd manipulated me, how thoroughly he'd invaded my mind and heart. He was proud of this monstrous betrayal. It wasn't enough that I was replaced. It was the reason. I was merely a means to an end, a resource to be harvested. Then, the cold woman's voice again, more urgent this time. What about Subject 003's primary host? Has she been reintegrated? A pause. Marcus's voice, hesitant for the first time. No, the neural damage was extensive. We couldn't risk contamination of the chimera synthesis. She's still in long-term stasis, but the prognosis for reanimation is poor. My mind reeled. Long-term stasis, neural damage, contamination. This wasn't just about me being replaced. It was about my very identity being a danger. The primary host, that was me. And Subject 003's primary host, another woman, just like me, discarded and ruined. A chilling implication settled over me. I was not the first, nor would I be the last. This wasn't a one-off cruel act. This was systematic, industrial, a factory of stolen souls. And my existence was a byproduct, a waste product to be efficiently disposed of. The full scope of Marcus's malevolence, the terrifying scale of his ambition, finally hit me. He wasn't just a betrayer. He was a creator of ghosts, a surgeon of souls, a collector of human identity, and then a destroyer of the source. My source. This wasn't personal anymore. This felt like a violation of humanity itself, and I was just one small, insignificant piece of his grand, gruesome design. My breathing quickened, a desperate, silent battle for air in the enveloping darkness. The despair that had threatened to consume me, that cold, suffocating darkness, suddenly imploded. It didn't vanish. It compacted, condensed, and then, with a silent, internal explosion, transformed. My shattered fragments didn't dissolve. They fused, superheated by a raging inferno I hadn't known I possessed. The fear, the disbelief, the absolute spiritual torment crystallized not into defeat, but into an incandescent, searing rage. It wasn't a hot, impulsive rage that blinds. It was cold, precise, like molten steel being forged into an impossibly sharp blade. Marcus Thorne, Project Director. He had dissected my life, copied my soul, and then planned my eternal imprisonment as a remnant, a waste product. And for 5 years I had loved him. I had trusted him. I had given him every single piece of myself, willingly, joyfully, believing in a future that was, all along, a meticulously crafted illusion. The rage was so profound, so utterly consuming, it was almost serene. It was the white-hot core of a star, burning away everything superfluous, leaving only an unyielding, unbreakable will. I was not Candace Miller, graphic designer, gentle soul, loving woman, not anymore. I was Subject 047, the prototype, the discard. And as Subject 047, I had seen the blueprint. I had seen the architectural plans for my own destruction. And now, I would use that knowledge. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through my left hand. Or was it my right? My perception of my physical body was still blurred, distant, but the internal shift was undeniable. The paralyzing fear that had held me immobile, even in my unseen restraints, began to recede, replaced by a strange, almost exhilarating clarity. My thoughts, once racing in a chaotic loop of horror and disbelief, now clicked into place with chilling precision. They wanted a cleanup? They wanted neural pathways irreversibly severed. They wanted no remnants. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had taken my body, my past, my love, but they had awakened something else entirely, something ancient and primal, something that recognized the language of predators because it was now becoming one. They thought they had reduced me to a primary host, a subject, a unit. They believed I was simply a vessel, a source of data, an experiment to be run and discarded. But what they hadn't accounted for was the inherent, stubborn, animalistic will to survive that lay dormant in even the most trusting heart. They had assumed my identity was fragile, easily replicated, transferable. They had made a fatal error. They had mistaken my gentleness for weakness, my love for blind devotion. The real Candace Miller, the original, the unduplicatable, was not a data point. She was a hurricane. And this hurricane had just been unleashed. The vague, muffled sounds returned, the clinical voices still debating my ultimate fate. But now, they were not just words. They were vulnerabilities. Each phrase was a thread, each concept a potential lever. Reintegration of subject 003 primary host. Contamination of chimera synthesis. Neural damage. They were worried about contamination, about remnants. This meant there were weaknesses in their system, flaws in their magnificent Project Chimera. The colder-than-ice woman, the one with glinting eyes, had said, "Ensure all neural pathways are irreversibly severed." That phrase, delivered with such cruel certainty, ignited a spark of defiance that quickly fanned into a roaring blaze. Irreversibly severed? We would see about that. The pain in my head, which had been a constant, dull throb, flared into a sudden, intense spike, then surprisingly began to recede, replaced by an odd, almost comforting numbness. It was as if my nervous system, under the immense internal pressure of my newfound resolve, was shutting down all non-essential functions, becoming a finely tuned instrument of vengeance. My breathing deepened, a slow, deliberate intake and release of air. My muscles, which moments ago had felt like lead, now hummed with a strange, latent energy. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. I was no longer a victim adrift in a sea of despair. I was a weapon, forged in the fires of unthinkable betrayal, aimed with singular purpose. The game had changed. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. And my move would rattle their entire, meticulously constructed world to its very core. The quiet in that sterile room, the hum of machinery, the distant murmur of voices, it was all just background noise now. My internal monologue, however, was a symphony of cold, strategic calculation. Marcus Thorne had believed he was playing chess, moving unsuspecting pawns. He was about to discover he had awoken the queen, and she played for keeps. The silence was suddenly not empty, but echoing with possibilities. My awareness, though still disconnected from my body, was sharpening, expanding. I could feel, or perhaps sense, the pulsating node deep within my brainstem, the very thing that had brought me to this hell. But the internal scream of terror had morphed into a hum of curiosity. It was connected. It was relaying information. If it could take information from me, could I not somehow take information from it? The idea was audacious, born of desperation and the raw fury that now fueled every synapse. My mind, still locked in the phantom limbs of the deep cryostasis, began to systematically search, not for escape in the physical sense, but for digital escape, for data. These voices, these clinical assessments, the very phrase neural pathways irreversibly severed, they were all broadcasting on a frequency I was now involuntarily attuned to. I wasn't just a subject, I was a living, breathing receiver. And if I was a receiver, I could also be a reverse engineer. I focused on the cold-eyed woman's voice, her cadence, her vocabulary, the subtle nuances when she spoke to Marcus compared to how she directed the junior researchers. Patterns. My graphic designer's mind, so attuned to patterns and discrepancies, latched onto them. This was no longer about emotions, it was about data streams. They wanted to make my long-term memory minimal. This meant they believed they had already extracted everything useful. This meant they were careless. This meant they were arrogant. And arrogance breeds vulnerabilities. Without a body to betray me, without eyes to register the subtle shifts in the sterile environment around me, my awareness became a pure informational entity. I felt, rather than saw, the faint flicker of energy signatures, the low hum of servers, the specific rhythm of a hard drive spinning up, the almost subliminal flow of networked data. I thought back to the initial baseline scans Marcus had performed, the equipment in our basement. It must have been connected to something, a network. And what kind of genius, even a twisted one, connects their ultra-secret, unethical research project to a network accessible from a remote location, however secure? A lazy one, an overconfident one. I reached out, an ethereal tendril of pure consciousness, towards the most prominent energy signature I could feel, the pulsing node in my own brain. It was a terrifying, exhilarating venture. It felt like pushing against a wall of pure force. But the very act of trying, the sheer will behind it, resonated with something within the device. A tiny, almost imperceptible feedback loop opened. And then, a torrent. Not images, not sounds, not even direct thoughts, but raw data. Encryption keys, network addresses, project code names alongside financial ledgers and schematics. These weren't my memories they were harvesting. They were my memories, being harvested. And the system they used to do it was vulnerable. It was like feeling the nervous system of an entire corporate entity. Project Chimera, Project Gemini. There were others too. Project Cerberus, Project Phoenix, Project Janus. An entire pantheon of stolen lives named with terrifying mythological grandeur. Each name was a folder containing thousands upon thousands of lives, meticulously catalogued, dissected, and then, judging by my own fate, discarded. My rage sharpened into a laser focus. This wasn't just about Marcus and me. This was about hundreds, perhaps thousands, of subjects. Each a complete, complex human being reduced to a unit of data, a stepping stone in Marcus Thorne's monstrous ascent. This profound understanding of the sheer scale of the operation didn't overwhelm me. It solidified my resolve, crystallizing my fury into an unyielding mission. I would not just reclaim my identity. I would dismantle his empire piece by agonizing piece, and I would start with the blueprint I was already connected to. The connection, once a faint whisper, solidified into a roaring torrent. It wasn't just data. It was the entire operational architecture of Thorne Industries. Their research, their financials, their personnel files. My years as a graphic designer, painstakingly learning the intricate logic of code and algorithms to create visual information, suddenly metamorphosed into an unexpected weapon. I could see the system as if it were a complex, multi-layered design. Vulnerabilities glowed like neon signs. This wasn't about conventional revenge, it was about digital warfare, fought from the spectral realm of my stasis. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but I could touch their network, an invisible phantom in the machine. My first target was subtle, almost imperceptible. I didn't want to alert them. Not yet. I burrowed deep into their system logs, tracing the pathways of Marcus's personal communications. There it was, his private email, encrypted, but the node in my brain, having been fed by his systems for years, whispered the decryption key. He had a mistress, of course, a young, ambitious junior researcher named Selena, who Marcus had been grooming for the next phase of Project Chimera. He was feeding her the exact same lines he fed me, cultivating the same trust, collecting the same data. My own betrayal, echoed and amplified. A cold, precise smile formed in my mind. I began to subtly alter timestamps on critical files, ever so slightly, shifting the sequence of events in their project logs, creating infinitesimal discrepancies that would accumulate over time. A micro delay in a server response that only Marcus, with his obsessive need for perfection, would notice. A single, misplaced digit in a complex formula for neural integration. I wasn't destroying data. I was corrupting it, introducing a cancerous uncertainty at the fundamental level of their operation. I knew how Marcus's mind worked. He thrived on control and absolute precision. These minute, seemingly random errors would gnaw at him, consuming his focus, making him doubt his own infallibility. He would blame his team, demanding endless audits, creating internal strife. Then, I turned my attention to the other Candace, my duplicate, his precious C-Unit Zo47. I now had access to her operational parameters, her very codebase. She was a perfect reflection, an emotional echo. I started with her sleep cycles. Not a drastic change, but a slow, almost undetectable adjustment. A few minutes less sleep each night, cumulatively building, subtly eroding her emotional regulation. A flicker of anxiety introduced into her perfectly calibrated happiness. A fractional delay in her response time, just enough to be noticeable, but not immediately identifiable as sabotage. Marcus would unconsciously register these shifts, seeing his perfect Candace becoming less perfect. He wouldn't know why, but the seed of doubt would be planted. The personality overlay was supposed to be stable. What if it wasn't? What if it was decaying? My awareness lingered on the primary host of Subject 003, languishing in long-term stasis. I accessed her medical logs, the precise nature of her neural damage. Marcus wanted no remnants. I would make sure he was haunted by them. I began to subtly leak encrypted fragments of her sensory data, phantom smells, distorted visual flashes, faint auditory echoes, into the peripheral monitors of the operating lab. Just enough to be registered subliminally by the technicians, to trigger unease, to suggest a lingering conscious presence within the supposedly inert specimen. Their carefully constructed clinical detachment would begin to fray. They would start to feel watched. They would start to wonder about the souls they were harvesting. This was just the beginning. I was a ghost in their machine, and I was just learning to haunt. The game was mine now. The subtle sabotage, the insidious rot I introduced into their meticulously ordered system was merely the overture. The phantom data leaks, the shifted timestamps, the imperceptible degradation of my clone, these were the whispers of an approaching storm. Now it was time for the thunder to roll, for the lightning to strike. Marcus Thorne had meticulously destroyed my life. I would reciprocate with interest, utterly eradicating his. My focus sharpened, narrowing to a single, relentless point. Marcus Thorne. I had his entire digital life at my fingertips. His private financial records, his offshore accounts, the illicit funding sources for Project Chimera, laundered through shell corporations and front charities. The names of his co-conspirators, his board members, the politicians he'd bribed, the doctors he'd strong-armed into silence. It was all there, a sprawling, interconnected web of corruption and human rights violations. But my target was more intimate, more agonizing. I wanted to break him from the inside out, atom by atom, until nothing remained but the hollow shell of the monster he was. First, the other Candace, the perfect operational subject. I had spent countless hours with Marcus, dissecting relationship dynamics, discussing what made a partnership truly thrive. He'd meticulously logged every nuance of my emotional responses, categorizing them, optimizing them. He'd built her to be his ideal partner, a perpetual source of validation and simulated affection. Now, I would turn her into his greatest torment. I accessed her core programming, not to damage her physically, but to subtly warp the perfectly calibrated affection she showed him. I inverted the emotional cues ever so slightly. A loving glance became a flicker of disdain. A tender touch lingered a fraction too long, morphing into a suffocating embrace. Her voice, so like my own, began to carry an almost imperceptible undertone of mockery, a barely audible sneer in her tone when she praised him. The words were the same, but the delivery shifted. infusing every interaction with a chilling, unsettling dissonance. He wouldn't be able to pinpoint it, but he would feel it. The slow, agonizing erosion of his perfect love. Then, there was Selena, his new, unsuspecting target. I didn't want to save her. I wanted her to be a vector for his destruction. I used the network's internal communication system, untraceable from the outside, to orchestrate the subtle manipulation of their affair. Anonymous messages, ostensibly from a jealous rival within the project, detailing the other Candace's, increasing instability. Planting seeds of doubt about the viability of C-Unit 047, hinting at technical flaws and operational compromises. These weren't overt. They were whispers, designed to escalate the tension between Marcus and Selena, feeding his paranoia, making him question the loyalty of everyone around him. He relied on control. I would introduce chaotic variables into every facet of his personal life, making him constantly reevaluate his reality. Next, his reputation. Marcus Thorne had carefully constructed an image of a visionary biotechnologist, a philanthropic genius. I began to plant digital breadcrumbs, untraceable and insidious. Screenshots of seemingly innocent conversations taken out of context, hinting at unethical practices leaked to academic ethics committees under anonymous accounts. Obscure financial transactions, just complex enough to trigger flags with regulatory bodies without actually revealing the full scope of his illicit funding. I targeted the core pillars of his public persona: his scientific integrity, his financial probity, his moral compass. Each leak was small, designed to create a cumulative effect, a slow, cancerous spread of doubt. He wouldn't be able to address them directly, because they were too vague, too disparate, but they would begin to erode the untouchable image he had so carefully cultivated. His public speaking engagements would see subtle drops in attendance. His grant applications would experience unexplained delays. The accolades would dry up. Finally, the ultimate target: his control. He prized it above all else. He was a micromanager, a meticulous planner. I began to subtly, systematically sabotage his most critical projects. The neural bypass protocol that was supposed to sever my connection? Every time it was initiated, I twisted a single parameter, injecting a minute, harmless but utterly disruptive error into the system. A flicker in the monitoring displays, a momentary data corruption that would force a reboot, delaying his work, making him question the reliability of his own technology. The carefully cultivated data streams from Project Chimera? I introduced minute, illogical correlations, statistical anomalies that would send his analysts spiraling into endless, fruitless investigations, trying to reconcile contradictory data points that I had meticulously fabricated. He would become engulfed in a sea of his own making, his brilliant mind drowning in the very data he had so ruthlessly stolen and manipulated. He wanted to control existence itself. I would make his own existence uncontrollable, a living nightmare of self-inflicted chaos. He thought he could play God. I was merely reminding him of purgatory. The deep cryostasis, once a dreaded prison, had become my private digital theater. I was the silent, invisible audience, watching Marcus Thorne's meticulously constructed world unravel, atom by atom. The view through his own omnipresent network was exhilaratingly clear, an intricate tapestry of his downfall, woven with the threads I had so carefully plucked and reknotted. My initial fear, my gut-wrenching despair, had transmuted into something far more potent, a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction. He began to show the cracks barely a month after my awakening. The first signs were subtle. His carefully manicured hair, usually impeccable, developed an errant strand. His tailored suits, once crisp, sometimes seemed a little rumpled. His eyes, perpetually sharp, now carried a faint, telltale redness around the rims. The almost imperceptible distortions I'd introduced into the other Candace were working their corrosive magic. I watched through discreet cameras in their home as he tried to analyze her, trying to pinpoint the source of his discomfort. He'd hold her gaze, searching for the warmth he knew should be there, only to be met with that unnerving, subtly mocking flicker in her eyes. He'd run internal diagnostics on her, meticulously checking every parameter, but his own senses, his deep, primal understanding of me, told him something was wrong. His perfect creation was flawed, not in a measurable way, but in an unsettling, existential way. I watched him pace their study late into the night, a glass of amber liquid clutched in his hand, a frustrated scowl etched on his face. The man who had been so sure of his absolute control was now grappling with phantom imperfections in his own handiwork. Then came the professional unraveling. The minor anomalies I'd introduced into the project data began to metastasize. Meetings descended into chaos as Marcus, desperate for answers, raged at his team, accusing them of incompetence, blind to the true source of their woes. The once efficient Thorn Industries, a beacon of cutting-edge bioengineering, became a quagmire of internal suspicion and frantic, fruitless audits. I saw the cold-eyed woman, his second-in-command, Dr. Eris, watching him with increasing concern, a flicker of something close to fear in her glacial eyes. She saw the empire she had helped him build beginning to crumble, and she couldn't articulate why. The financial irregularities, though not yet leading to outright investigations, were enough to spook his most loyal investors. I watched their high-stakes video conferences, seeing the subtle shifts in their body language, the narrowing of their eyes, the nervous glances. The money, the lifeblood of his monstrous projects, was beginning to dry up. The affair with Selena, the junior researcher, imploded with spectacular, self-inflicted damage. I'd carefully seeded the right anonymous communications, weaving a narrative that painted C-Unit 047 as not just unstable, but dangerously unpredictable, a ticking emotional time bomb. Marcus, already drowning in paranoia and sleep deprivation caused by my subtle manipulations of his clone's sleep cycle, became convinced his perfect Candace was unraveling. In a fit of rage and fear, he confronted Selena, accusing her of deliberately sabotaging C-Unit 047's performance data, believing her to be an aspiring usurper. I recorded the entire explosive argument, the bitter recriminations, Selena's furious denial, and eventual shattering realization of his true manipulative nature. She resigned, not just from the project, but from the company, threatening legal action, the kind of public scandal he desperately tried to avoid. The man who could orchestrate an entire human life was utterly incapable of managing the fallout from a simple illicit affair. The irony was sweet, a rich dessert. He had created monsters. Now they were turning on him. My satisfaction wasn't just vengeful, it was deeply intellectual. I saw him trapped in a labyrinth of his own making, a victim of his own hubris. Every desperate decision he made, every panicked attempt to regain control, only served to tighten the noose I had silently, invisibly crafted. He was a rat in a maze, programmed for failure, and I was the unseen hand twisting the levers. The man who had sought to control existence itself was now watching his own existence spiral into an abyss of his own making. And I, in my silent, dark observation chamber, smiled. Not with cruelty, but with triumph. The true operational subject had truly become operational. The final unraveling was swift, brutal, and exquisitely satisfying. Marcus Thorn, trapped by the coils of his own deceit, lashed out with increasing desperation, alienating allies, burning bridges, and confirming every insidious whisper I had sowed. The internal audits he himself ordered, meant to identify the saboteur he was now convinced existed within his ranks, instead unearthed the very financial irregularities I had subtly exposed: the shell corporations, the illicit grants, the evidence of human experimentation, all meticulously collected and arranged by my invisible hand, began to surface, not as a single catastrophic exposé, but as a relentless drip, drip, drip of incontrovertible proof. Key investors, smelling blood in the water, pulled out, initiating a cascade of bankruptcies that brought down not just Thorn Industries, but several of its shadowy satellite ventures, including the one secretly housing the remnants of Project Gemini. The media, initially fed cautious anonymous tips, seized upon the escalating scandal with veracity. The once glowing profiles of Marcus Thorn as a visionary turned into scathing indictments of a megalomaniacal monster. I watched, through the network feed, the live news reports, the panicked press conferences, the slow, agonizing public immolation of his reputation. He was sued from every direction, for fraud, for unethical research, for human rights violations. His carefully constructed life, designed on the backs of discarded subjects like me, crumbled into dust. He wasn't just professionally ruined, he was utterly, irrevocably destroyed. He was stripped of his licenses, his assets seized, his name synonymous with scientific corruption and monstrous hubris. The final images I saw of him, before my access to his personal data streams mercifully severed, a mercy I did not extend but simply occurred as his entire infrastructure collapsed, was of a haunted, emaciated man shambling under the glare of paparazzi flashbulbs, his eyes vacant, utterly broken. He hadn't just lost his company, he had lost his mind, trapped in the very labyrinth of paranoia I had constructed for him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, my consciousness began to re-emerge from the digital ether, from the suffocating void of stasis. The humming, the faint pressure, the distant voices, they were still there, but now they were different. A soft, unfamiliar voice, not clinical but gentle, said, "She's stabilizing. We have a pulse, faint but steady. Brain activity is returning to baseline parameters. It's a miracle." Miracle. They didn't know. They couldn't know. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph so profound it almost brought me to my knees, if I had knees to be brought to. When I truly awoke, it wasn't in the sterile white lab, but a quiet, sunlit room, the scent of antiseptic replaced by fresh-cut flowers. I learned I had been rescued from an unsanctioned illegal research facility, along with dozens of others, by a joint task force acting on anonymous tips. Anonymous tips that only I, from my internal prison, could have provided. They called me Patient Zero, the key to unlocking an entire criminal enterprise. My body was weak, ravaged by prolonged stasis, but my mind was sharper, clearer, and infinitely more powerful than ever before. The node in my brain, the foreign matter that had been both my prison and my key to freedom, was gone. Removed, they said, by a brilliant, compassionate neurosurgeon during the rescue operation. But they didn't know it had already served its purpose, that I had extracted everything I needed, and more. Even without the node, the neural pathways it had forged, the profound connection to the digital world, remained. Like a secret language only I could speak. Life, for me, didn't just return to normal. It soared beyond anything I could have imagined. I was no longer Candace Miller, the graphic designer. I was Candace Miller, the survivor, the unwitting architect of justice. Using the residual knowledge, the deep, intuitive understanding of digital systems I had forged in my stasis, I rebuilt myself. I founded a cutting-edge cybersecurity firm, specializing in data forensics and digital counterterrorism. My unique perspective on hidden networks, on the subtle corruption of data, was unrivaled. I became a ghost in the machine, but this time, a benevolent one, uncovering complex criminal networks, dismantling corporate malfeasance, and exposing the very kind of predatory individuals Marcus Thorn represented. My firm became renowned, revered. I moved into a sleek, minimalist penthouse overlooking the city Marcus Thorn once believed he owned. My art, once a hobby, became an expression of my new power, intricate digital tapestries that hinted at the hidden truths beneath the surface. I stood on my balcony one evening, the city lights shimmering below like a scattered galaxy. I occasionally caught glimpses of the news, snippets of Marcus's ongoing legal battles, each one a nail in his coffin, his name now a byword for criminal depravity. His perfect Candace, C Unit 047, had destabilized completely after his downfall, unable to function without his constant input, a broken doll in a forgotten lab. Project Chimera was a nightmare consigned to history. I was not just free, I was dominant. I controlled my narrative, my future, and discreetly, the subtle levers of power in the world I now inhabited. The ultimate victory was not just his utter ruin, but my absolute self-made triumph. His betrayal had given me a weapon beyond anything he could have conceived. He had sought to erase me, to reduce me to a redundant remnant. Instead, he had forged an apex predator, rising from the ashes of his monstrous ambition, more powerful, more aware, and more terrifyingly effective than he, in his wildest, most arrogant dreams, could have ever imagined.